But back to Rwanda, Strasbourg judges could be on the brink of backing down over the blocking orders that stopped Rwanda removal flights. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, revealed this week that she has been encouraged by her discussions with the European Court of Human Rights. These discussions could lead to removing a key barrier and finally see Channel migrants sent to the East African nation. The Home Office's first flight was blocked at the 11th hour by an anonymous Strasbourg judge, thought as it happens to be a Russian in a bar, but that hasn't been confirmed, using an injunction known as a Rule 39 order. The government's illegal migration bill sets out plans to allow ministers to ignore Rule 39 measures unless Strasbourg agrees to rein in their use. Now, I'm delighted to have my panel still with me. As I was reading that out, I was rather worried that it's the illegal migration bill, which makes it sound if the bill is illegal rather than the migration is illegal. I wonder if it should be hyphenated. Anyway, Stephen, do you think the ECHR will make an accommodation? It did before. It did over prisoner voting rights.
They will until the first horror occurs there in Kigali. The first person gets murdered or whatever. But can I just very, very quick... I'm sorry about this, but you mentioned this very important thing about Antonio Guterres from talking about this rather tortured and laboured analogy about, we're on thin ice and the ice is melting. The one thing, I happen to believe in the broad thrust of this, but the fact is that the case has not been made. A perfect example is here in London, where the ultra-low emission zone is wildly, massively unpopular everywhere outside the centre of town, and it's simply not good enough for people to stand on the hill drenched in their purity, wearing the silken clothes of freedom and purity, and saying, look, this is good for you. They've got to bring the people with you. I used to say my constituents are more worried about 8:30 than 2030, but we've got to bring that, and Guterres is not doing that.
The problem is we can't discuss this because we all agree. No, and we've got to have an element of disagreement.
But on Rwanda, I think it was, as is widely known, the Israelis tried this 10 years ago. They sent 4,000 people to Rwanda who then promptly disappeared. I think your point about the European courts in Strasbourg, I think they could well come to an accommodation because they very much doubt that anything will happen after. Do you honestly think that we're going to be taking 8, 9, 10-year-old children onto planes and taking them to Kigali? I just don't see it.
But it's very rarely children coming over. 70% are adult males, aren't they?
Well, this is a real thing that absolutely infuriates me. There's two categories here. There are many subcategories, but there are certain people who are attracted by the pull factor, the fact that we have a completely free and open labour market here. You can go and work in almost anywhere. You don't have to prove anything. The Home Office is so sclerotic and incompetent that they'll not catch up with you for 5 or 6 years, by which time you can then apply for naturalisation. But the other people, so I'm talking about your Albanian car wash, that on the boat, back you go straight away. But other people, I'm sorry, that are genuine people, the same people that came on the Kinder transport in the 1930s and the people that we traditionally welcomed, we must not lose sight of them.
Well, that's a fair enough point, David. Don't you think that there are some people we have to look after who deserve refuge, but we also need an efficient system for returning people who oughtn't to be here?
If only, I think, is the answer to both of those. I think it's also worth... Stephen mentioned the failure of the Israeli scheme. A country that has got a remarkable reputation for keeping control of its borders and for thoroughgoing efficiency, namely Denmark, is actually using Rwanda at the moment, and apparently doing so, as it were, within Denmark, uncontroversially and efficiently. Maybe we should draw a lesson from that. But again, for me, this is an issue of utter fundamental principle. The defiance of our frontiers by boat after boat, as it were, carefully helped over by the Royal Navy, carefully helped over by the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, is frankly a scandal and a disgrace. It's a scandal and a disgrace to everybody who's ever had to go through security at an airport and frequently semi to be strip searched. It defies the absolute principle of the sanctity of frontiers of a nation state and the kind of noises.
But we can't let people drown in the Channel. We've got to rescue them if there is.
I'm sorry, I'm
come on, you can't say we can't rescue people who are at risk of drowning.
Our absurd sentimentality is deliberately being exploited by fundamentally wicked people. Our behaviour, it is precisely our behaviour, the behaviour of our authorities, of the RNIA, of the French, which encourages the traffic. This is why it goes on. It goes on because it is enabled, it is facilitated, and it is fundamentally unpunished. A handful of people. In other words, what we're seeing is characteristic, and I think we would both agree, I'm not sure whether Stephen would, of a gross general failure of fundamental law enforcement.
So, Stephen, you would accept that there are large numbers of people who ought to go back. You want to protect the children and you want to protect the halt and the lame, and I don't disagree with you on that. But actually, if 70% are young men, sending them to Rwanda is perfectly fair.
I don't really care where we send them. They have no right to be here. And I have to say, it grates violently with me to think that somebody's building a palace in Tirana on untaxed work that they're doing in this country. And that's not even, we haven't even mentioned organised crime, because, you know, what better foot soldiers are for organised crime than people who are completely undocumented? I mean, my views of the fact we do need ID cards.
But there's just this universal complacency, isn't there? And the other thing is that there is a quasi, there are two forms of justification for it. For a very large part of the left, the notion of a national frontier is an outrage. There is a thing called common humanity, and to divide them into nations and to have barriers, it is disgrace. And the other thing is, of course, business is fundamentally addicted and hooked on immigration.
Cheap labour.
And wherever you look, and the tremendous problems that we are having with the vast masses of our native population, if I'm allowed to use that word, deliberately absenting themselves from the labour market for whatever reason, that is the other face of relentless immigration.
And this must
be a catastrophe.
This must be a fundamental point, because cheap labour has meant that we've got no productivity increases because business hasn't invested in equipment. It's not tax write-offs for corporation tax.
This arable land surrounded by fish is having to import food. You know, the other day, Valentine's Day, bringing roses in from Ecuador. But look, the problem here is we had a big demonstration, a big march in London last week. One of the reasons why I'd like to not just appear on GB News, but I watch and listen to GB News, is because you do hear the other side. You hardly ever hear. We had all these people last week with banners and placards saying, you know, there's no such thing as a border. But, you know, as the great poet said, you know, the best lack all conviction, but the worst are full of a terrible intensity. The argument isn't simply challenged enough. Do